It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon when Karen arrived home from a long day of shopping. Sauntering up the driveway, she noticed a familiar square box sitting on her doorstep. Her latest online order had arrived. A sly grin crept across her face as she quickly snatched up the package and hustled inside. "Ah, finally," Karen exclaimed, tearing open the cardboard. "This new designer purse is going to look fabulous." She admired the luxurious leather and gleaming gold hardware, giddily placing the bag on her arm. Stepping back to get a better look, Karen froze as she noticed the shipping label. This wasn't her package at all. It belonged to her neighbor, Jamie. No, no, Karen muttered, her excitement quickly turning to panic. "I can't be seen with someone else's delivery." Frantically, she darted to her front window, peeking out to see if Jamie was home. The coast was clear. Karen tossed the purse back into the box and rushed outside, hastily placing it back on Jamie's doorstep. As she turned to slink back inside, movement from the house next door caught her eye. There stood Jamie, a puzzled expression on her face as she retrieved the package. "Karen? What are you doing with my stuff?" Jamie called out. Caught red-handed, Karen froze, her mouth agape. She frantically searched her mind for a believable excuse, but her mind was racing. I was just making sure it was delivered safely," Karen stammered. "You know, with all the package thieves these days, I wanted to keep an eye on it for you." Jamie furrowed her brow, clearly unconvinced by Karen's flustered explanation. "Well, thank you. I guess," Jamie replied hesitantly, "but I'm perfectly capable of taking care of my own deliveries." Karen forced a nervous laugh, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Of course. I was just being a good neighbor, that's all," she said, waving dismissively. As Jamie disappeared back into her house, Karen hurried inside, her heart pounding. She knew she had to be more careful in the future. Jamie was always suspicious of her odd behavior. But Karen couldn't help herself. Her insatiable desire for the finer things in life often overrode her better judgment. Little did she know, her sticky-fingered tendencies were about to land her in a world of trouble. The following day, Karen was out tending to her meticulously manicured lawn when she noticed a sleek black sedan pull up in front of Jamie's house. Two well-dressed individuals, a man and a woman, emerged from the vehicle and approached Jamie's front door. Karen's eyes narrowed as she watched the exchange, straining to hear the muffled conversation. After a few minutes, the strangers turned and headed back to their car, their expressions unreadable. Curiosity piqued, Karen quickly abandoned her gardening and hurried over to Jamie's door, knocking urgently. Jamie, are you all right?" she called out, feigning concern. The door swung open, revealing a visibly shaken Jamie. "Oh, Karen, it's you," she said, trying to force a smile. "Everything's fine. I just had a couple of detectives come by, that's all." Karen's eyes widened, her mind racing with questions. "Detectives? What on earth for?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sincerity. Jamie hesitated, clearly unsure of how much to reveal. They were asking about a missing package," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. Karen felt her heart skip a beat. Asterisk the package. Could they know asterisk? Missing package. How dreadful, Karen exclaimed, pressing a hand to her chest in an exaggerated display of concern. "Do you have any idea what could have happened to it?" Jamie shook her head, a worried frown creasing her brow. "No, I have no idea. I just hope they're able to figure it out," she replied. Karen nodded sympathetically, her mind whirling. If the detectives were already investigating the missing package, it was only a matter of time before they traced it back to her. "Well, I'm sure it will all work out," Karen said, flashing Jamie a reassuring smile. "Let me know if there's anything I can do to help, all right." Before Jamie could respond, Karen turned and hurried back to her own house, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to act fast if she wanted to avoid the consequences of her actions. Asterisk, this is bad. This is really, really bad, asterisk, Karen thought, her mind racing with panic. Asterisk-y, have to get that package back before the detectives find out it was me, asterisk. That night, as the neighborhood slumbered, Karen crept out of her house, a small flashlight in hand. Darting across the shadowy lawn, she reached Jamie's front door and quickly began rifling through the potted plants lining the porch, searching for a hidden key. Come on, where is it? She muttered under her breath, her fingers trembling. After a tense moment, her hand grasped a small metal key, and she let out a quiet sigh of relief. Carefully, she slid the key into the lock and turned it, wincing at the soft click as the door swung open. Pausing to listen for any signs of movement, Karen slipped inside, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She made her way to the living room, her eyes scanning the area until they landed on the cardboard box sitting on the coffee table. Bingo, she whispered, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. Snatching up the package, Karen turned to leave, but a sudden noise from the hallway made her freeze. Holding her breath, she flattened herself against the wall, the box clutched tightly to her chest. Footsteps, soft, muffled footsteps, slowly approaching. Karen's heart raced as she watched a shadowy figure emerge from the darkness, a baseball bat in hand. She braced herself for the inevitable confrontation, her mind racing with desperate pleas and excuses. Freeze, a deep voice commanded, the beam of a flashlight momentarily blinding Karen. Squinting, she found herself staring down the barrel of the gun, wielded by a tall, imposing figure. Please, don't shoot," Karen stammered, her voice trembling. "I can explain." The figure moved closer, the light illuminating the face of a middle-aged man in a crisp, navy blue uniform. "Ma'am, drop the package and put your hands where I can see them," the officer ordered, his tone unwavering. Realizing there was no escape, Karen slowly lowered the box to the floor, her hands shaking as she raised them in surrender. "You're under arrest for breaking and entering and theft," the officer said, placing Karen in handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." As the officer read her Miranda rights, Karen felt a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. She had been caught red-handed, and now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The bright flashing lights of the police cruiser cast an eerie glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood as Karen was led out of Jamie's house in handcuffs. Onlookers peered out from behind curtains, whispering to one another in hushed tones as the disgraced woman was placed in the backseat of the vehicle. Karen's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined that her sticky-fingered antics would lead to such a dramatic and public downfall. As the car pulled away, the realization of her situation began to sink in. Arriving at the police station, Karen was ushered into a small, windowless interrogation room, the weight of the handcuffs a constant reminder of her predicament. The detective, a stern-faced woman with piercing eyes, entered the room and took a seat across the table, fixing Karen with an unwavering gaze. "So, Mrs. Karen Larson, let's start with the obvious question. Why did you steal your neighbor's package?" the detective asked, her voice calm and measured. Karen swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. She had rehearsed countless excuses and alibis in her mind, but now, under the detective's intense scrutiny, her confidence had all but evaporated. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her eyes darting around the room. "It was an accident, I swear. I thought it was my own package, and I just got carried away." The detective leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "An accident, huh?" she said, a hint of skepticism in her voice. "That's a rather convenient excuse, don't you think?" Karen felt a lump forming in her throat as the detective continued to question her, poking holes in her flimsy explanation. It was clear that the police had been watching her for some time, and they had no intention of letting her off the hook. As the interrogation wore on, Karen's bravado crumbled, and she found herself admitting to a long history of petty theft and entitled behavior. The detective listened intently, her expression hardening with each new revelation. "Well, Mrs. Larson, it seems you have quite the track record," the detective said, shaking her head. "And this latest incident is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm afraid you're looking at some serious charges." Karen's stomach churned with dread, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. She had never imagined that her thirst for luxury and status would lead her down this path, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. As the detective left the room, Karen felt a wave of panic wash over her. Her privileged life was about to be turned upside down, and she had no one to blame but herself. The following morning, Karen sat in the cramped holding cell, her hands trembling as she stared at the bare concrete walls. The harsh fluorescent lights and the persistent hum of the ventilation system had left her feeling disoriented and overwhelmed. As the events of the previous night play out in her mind, Karen struggled to come to terms with the reality of her situation. She had always considered herself above the law, immune to the consequences that plagued regular people. But now, stripped of her freedom and forced to confront her own misdeeds, she felt utterly powerless. The sound of a key turning in the cell door jolted Karen from her thoughts, and she looked up to see a uniformed officer standing in the doorway. "Time for your arraignment," the officer said, his voice gruff and devoid of sympathy. Karen's heart raced as she was led down the hallway and into a crowded courtroom. The judge, a stern-faced man with piercing eyes, addressed her directly, reading out the charges: breaking and entering, theft, and trespassing. Karen's mouth went dry as she listened, her mind racing to find the words to defend herself. But as she opened her mouth, the judge cut her off, his voice booming through the room. "How do you plead, Mrs. Larson?" Karen felt the eyes of the entire courtroom upon her, and for a moment she was paralyzed by the weight of their judgment. But then a glimmer of her old defiance flickered to life, and she straightened her shoulders, her voice surprisingly steady. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she declared, her chin held high. The judge raised a single eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by her bravado. "Very well," he said, his gaze narrowing. "Bail is set at $50,000. You are to have no contact with the victim or any other witnesses, and you are to remain within the county limits until your trial date." Karen's heart sank as the bailiff moved to escort her out of the courtroom. She had never imagined that her sense of entitlement would lead her to this place, and the realization that she was no longer in control of her own fate was a bitter pill to swallow. As she was led away, Karen couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The world she had once taken for granted was crumbling around her, and she had no idea what the future held. While Karen languished in her cell, awaiting the next steps in her legal proceedings, an unexpected visitor arrived at the police station. It was Jamie, Karen's neighbor, and the very person whose package she had stolen. Approaching the front desk, Jamie cleared her throat, drawing the attention of the officer on duty. "Excuse me, I'd like to speak to the detective in charge of the Karen Larson case," she said, her voice firm and determined. The officer eyed her curiously, but nodded and disappeared down the hallway, returning a few moments later with the stern-faced detective from the previous night. "How can I help you, ma'am?" the detective asked, eyeing Jamie with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Jamie took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I'd like to drop the charges against Karen," she said, her gaze unwavering. The detective's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and she shook her head in disbelief. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's not really your decision to make," the detective replied. "Karen's actions were a clear violation of the law, and the state has a vested interest in pursuing this case." Jamie nodded, fully expecting this response. "I understand that," she said, "but I also believe that people can change, and that sometimes a little bit of compassion and understanding can go a long way. The detective studied Jamie's face for a moment, her expression softening ever so slightly. Look, I get where you're coming from, but Karen has a history of this kind of behavior, the detective explained. She's not exactly a first-time offender, and I'm not sure a slap on the wrist is going to be enough to change her ways. Jamie's brow furrowed, and she leaned forward, her voice taking on a more urgent tone. I know Karen can be difficult, and her actions were certainly wrong, she acknowledged. But I also believe that there's more to her story than meets the eye. Maybe if she had a chance to make amends, to really understand the consequences of her choices, she could turn things around. The detective considered Jamie's words for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she let out a heavy sigh and nodded. All right, I'll tell you what, she said. I'll see what I can do to get the charges reduced, but only if Karen agrees to participate in a diversion program. It's not a guarantee, but it might be her best shot at avoiding jail time. Jamie's face lit up with relief and gratitude. Thank you, detective, she said, her voice sincere. I really believe this could be the wake-up call Karen needs. As the detective turned to leave, Jamie couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, with a little bit of understanding and a second chance, Karen could finally start to see the error of her ways. Karen sat in the dimly lit visiting room, her eyes downcast and her expression resigned. She had expected to be facing a lengthy prison sentence, and the prospect of losing her freedom had filled her with a sense of dread. But when the detective had returned to her cell earlier that day, the news she brought was both surprising and perplexing. Your neighbor, Jamie, has requested that the charges against you be reduced, the detective had said, her voice tinged with a hint of disbelief. She's willing to give you a second chance, but on one condition. You have to complete a diversion program. Karen's head had snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and skepticism. A diversion program? She had echoed, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. The detective had nodded, her expression serious. It's a chance for you to avoid jail time and get your life back on track, she had explained. But it's going to require a lot of work on your part. Are you willing to do it? Karen had hesitated, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She had spent her entire life avoiding consequences, relying on her wealth and privilege to shield her from the consequences of her actions. But now, faced with the prospect of a genuine second chance, she found herself at a crossroads. And so here she sat, waiting anxiously for Jamie to arrive. As the door to the visiting room swung open, Karen felt her heart skip a beat. Jamie, she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. Hello, Karen, Jamie replied, her expression neutral. An awkward silence hung in the air for a moment, the weight of their history palpable. I heard about the deal you made with the detective, Karen began, her gaze shifting nervously. I don't understand why you would do that for me. After everything I've done. Jamie held up a hand, silencing Karen mid-sentence. I know what you've done, Karen, she said, her voice calm and measured. And I'm not going to pretend that it's okay. But I also believe that people can change if they're willing to put in the work. Karen felt a lump forming in her throat, her eyes welling with tears. I don't know if I can do it, she admitted, her voice trembling. I've spent my whole life taking the easy way out, and I don't know if I have it in me to change. Jamie reached across the table, placing her hand gently on Karen's. Well, then I guess it's a good thing you have someone to hold you accountable, she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. For the first time in a long while, Karen felt a glimmer of hope. With Jamie's support and the structure of the diversion program, maybe, just maybe, she could finally break the cycle of entitlement and selfishness that had defined her life. It wouldn't be easy, but as she looked into Jamie's eyes, she knew that this was her chance at redemption. Over the following months, Karen immersed herself in the diversion program, determined to prove that she could change. Gone were the days of flaunting her wealth and privilege, Instead, she found herself humbled, forced to confront the true consequences of her actions. The program's structured curriculum, which included community service, financial literacy classes, and intensive therapy sessions, challenged Karen in ways she had never experienced before. It was a painful and uncomfortable process, but as she gradually began to understand the impact of her behavior on others, a newfound sense of empathy and responsibility began to take root. Jamie, true to her word, became a constant source of support and accountability for Karen. She attended therapy sessions with her, helped her navigate the bureaucratic maze of the diversion program, and even secured her a part-time job at a local nonprofit organization. It was through this work that Karen truly began to understand the struggles of those less fortunate than herself. She witnessed firsthand the hardships faced by the community she had once so easily dismissed, and it sparked a profound shift in her perspective. As the months passed, Karen's transformation became increasingly evident. Her once haughty demeanor gave way to a more humble and compassionate approach to life. She apologized sincerely to Jamie, acknowledging the pain she had caused, and even reached out to other neighbors she had wronged, making amends where she could. The crowning moment came when Karen successfully completed the diversion program, emerging with a newfound sense of purpose and self-worth. The charges against her were dropped, and she was given a clean slate, a second chance to rebuild her life on a foundation of integrity and service. With Jamie's continued guidance and support, Karen embarked on a journey of personal growth and community involvement. She volunteered at local charities, became a mentor to underprivileged youth, and even started her own small business, using her entrepreneurial skills to create opportunities for those in need. The once entitled Karen had been reborn, her transformation a testament to the power of redemption and the transformative nature of second chances. As she looked back on the tumultuous events that had led her to this point, Karen couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the opportunity to make amends, but for the unexpected friendship that had blossomed with Jamie, her former neighbor, and the catalyst for her remarkable journey of change.